Alrighty.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to the show. I'm back at Busche's garage this weekend to work on the top end. What we're going to do today is properly check all the clearances in the engine. Everything will stop working pretty quickly if those things aren't measured. So I'm really excited to work with Busche today. He's going to show us how to do all that stuff, and we're going to get through the top part of the engine and then check all those clearances and hopefully build up the top end properly. So we're going to do a dry assemble and then take it all apart and then assemble again. But Jeff will explain all that stuff when we go in his shop. I thought I'd take you through Jeff's shop and maybe we could see what he's working on lately so you can get a kind of an idea of the kind of stuff that he does on a day-to-day basis. So we're gonna go check out his shop. He's gonna take us for a little tour and then we're gonna get started on the engine. So welcome back to the show, guys.
Welcome to Saturday's Wrench.
Yeah. Wrenchity-roo, wrench-a-wrench-wrenchity-roo. Jeffrey.
How's it going, Tony?
Good, how are you doing, man? Nice to see you again. What are you working on? This is his shop. This is the main bay of his shop, and Jeff's just gonna take us through and show us what he's working on these days.
I'll give you the 5-minute tour. All right, well, what's in the shop right now, I've got 2 bikes I'm working on. This one here on the main bench is a 73 CB350 Honda. I'm doing mechanical restoration on the bike, so that involves rebuilding the brakes, the forks, steering head bearings replaced with tapered roller bearings, engine-wise, complete carb rebuild.
Wow.
And adjustment, electronic ignition. I'm polishing all the covers.
Wow.
Frame touch up so that it looks good. Get rid of all the rust of the battery box and everything.
Yeah,
swing arm off for swing arm bushings. Yeah.
And what do you got in the back there?
So that's this one here, and then this bike here is really an amazing piece.
Wow,
This
that's
is
beautiful.
A 1974 Norton 850 Commando, and this bike is in fact brand new. But it hasn't been ridden for 35 years. It's the original owner. He purchased it back in 1976, brand new. Rode it for 96 miles. Here, I'll show you the speedometer. And I don't know if you can see that or not, but you can see it has 96 miles on it.
That's amazing. Holy.
So, you know, you would think being a brand new bike, you should be able to just give her a kick and go for a ride. But as with all things, they deteriorate with time.
Yeah.
So rubber parts, you know, air filter element is so degraded that it just turns to mush. When and you know, the tires are like hockey pucks and all this kind of stuff. So basically, I'm going from front to back, making sure that everything is good. Oil pump, took it apart, make sure it's pumping oil, carbs. Fork seals, new tires, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
So both of these bikes are fascinating jobs.
Yeah, for sure, man. Cool. Well, thanks for showing us that stuff, Jeff.
Yeah, no problem. Gives you a little bit of an idea of what I do.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
Job.
For sure.
And so this is the work bay, or the service bay part of my shop. And then on this side, this is kind of the workshop where some of the real magic happens.
Yeah.
And so as you can see, tools all over the place, and my soda blast cabinet for cleaning parts, and hydraulic presses and all this stuff.
We got everything laid out to do the engine here, and
yep.
Cool, man. That's great. So this is Jeff's shop, and it's a great little tour. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
All right. Before we actually start doing any work here, I'll just quickly go through what I've done to set the whole thing up and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. So just to make things easier, there's a big stack of paper this big, the instructions that come with all the different high performance parts. And so what I've done is gone through them and distilled it down to a checklist with all my clearances shown here. It just makes it easier. You don't have to keep rummaging through paperwork. Plus it's a good checklist so that we make sure we don't miss anything. So basically what I've done here is I set everything all up that I need in order to do the job, including the parts and the tools and the motor and everything like that. So you can see right here, I have everything all laid out. So we've got the cam sprocket, the cam itself, high performance, high lift cam. That's a beauty, that is. The rocker shafts, the rocker arms, which have been reconditioned and the faces renewed to like new condition, which you have to do if you're putting a new cam in an engine. You always have to either recondition the rocker arms or buy new ones, because old ones will wreck your new cam in no time at all. Okay, then these are the pods that go on either side of the cam carrier, and that's actually what the cam runs in, is these bores right here. We've got the seals and the gaskets all set out where they go. There's one on either side of the engine here. This is the cam chain tensioner and all its associated parts. This is actually a stopper used to find true top dead center, and we'll see that in action in a little bit here. Then as far as measuring tools, I've got a depth gauge to measure what's called the deck height of the pistons, and a dial indicator with some metal plates that I'll bolt to the top in order for the magnetic base to stick to something, because obviously this is all aluminum and magnets don't stick. I have these little lightweight springs set out here, which we'll use when we're checking all the measurements for the valve clearances to piston and so on. And when you're doing a high performance engine like this and modifying internal parts, you have to verify that everything is within spec and that you have at least the minimum clearances. If you don't, it'll all end in tears, because you'll start it up and then discover a valve is touching the piston or something. So that's definitely not good.
So we have everything set up to do the check. So
that's correct.
This is a dry run?
Yes, and that's one of the things about building a performance engine. If you're doing an engine using stock parts, so let's say you're just rebuilding it with second over pistons and stock valves and cam and so on, you don't have to do checks to make sure the valves aren't going to hit the pistons, because that's all figured out at the factory. But when you modify an engine like this, you have to basically do a dry assembly. So what I do is I install the pistons without the rings, which means that everything turns easier, and then we'll be assembling the head and the cam and everything on here without actually torquing everything right down solid for the final assembly.
Right.
And that allows us to get our clearance checks, but we can disassemble it and then reassemble it for the final time once we've verified all the clearance checks.
Okay.
That's why you have to do that. So that's why performance engine building is more expensive than if you're just rebuilding it with stock parts, because basically you have to rebuild the top end twice in order to verify all the clearances and so on.
Okay, so
I have this degree wheel is set up on the end of the crank in order to give us a more accurate reading of degrees before and after top dead center and so on. And we need this much accuracy in order to verify that the cam is installed properly, so that it's doing what the manufacturer wants it to do. That's another part of the verification process. So you can see that a very small movement of the piston shows really big here. So you need one of these to do that. So I guess we'll get down and do it.
All right, so let's get to work, guys.
In order to make it easier to measure the various clearances for the valve train, Jeff uses a spring compressor to remove the springs, keepers, and retainers from the cylinder head. He stresses not to use a magnet when removing the keepers due to the fact that it could magnetize the parts and potentially attract small pieces of metal when the engine is in operation.
So now we can disassemble the springs. There's the spring retainer. Beautiful, beautiful. High performance parts, and these are heavier duty spring rate springs. There's two springs, a small one and a large one, for each valve. And then you can see the beautiful bronze guides that have been installed here. And then there's a spacer right here. And one of the checks that we have to do is measuring what's called the installed height. So when it's installed like this, you can actually see here that the spring is a lot longer before it's installed. So one of the checks we have to do is to make sure that the spring length when it's installed is to the manufacturer's specification. And also another check that you can do is checking to make sure that the force in pounds per square inch is correct when the spring is compressed. So we'll do that. And then now the valve, I'm just wiggling the valve to check clearance, and that feels beautiful. It runs and slides, there's no stickiness or anything in there, so head's been very well done. Now what I generally do is stack the parts back together again, and that way you don't lose anything. And then I don't have my marker here, but I always mark the valve face to make sure that when identify the parts. Now I'm just going to set them here in basically order. So we'll have number 1 intake, number 1 exhaust, number 2 intake, number 2 exhaust set there.
Perfect.
All organized so that everything goes back.
After everything has been disassembled in the head, Jeff replaces the heavy springs with lightweight springs. The springs have enough pressure to hold the valves in their closed positions and allow the rocker arms to follow the camshaft, but are light enough for us to push on them with one finger. They'll make it easy for us to complete certain measurements that you will see demonstrated in a moment. When installing the lightweight springs, Jeff made sure to verify the springs were the correct length to allow the valve to travel to the specifications of the camshaft before binding. He had to make sure there was enough clearance in the spring to allow the camshaft to open the valves as it normally would, and then some, before it binded. By pressing the valve open with his finger, he measured that there was 405 thousandths of an inch before full coil bind, and the lift on the cam is 334 thousandths of an inch. So we had a clearance of 71 thousandths of an inch, which is a pretty safe margin. Basically, there was more travel in the springs than the camshaft would allow before full coil bind, so we knew the engine was safe to turn over. Next, we need to verify piston deck height. That is the distance between the squish band on the top of the piston head and the top deck of the cylinder barrels, where the cylinder head bolts on when the piston is at top dead center. The spec given to us by the piston manufacturer is 30 thousandths of an inch minimum. In my particular situation, to achieve the required clearance, we needed to add a second base gasket in order to lift the barrels up to give us a little more space so that the piston sits lower in the cylinders. We add the second base gasket, do our measurement, and come to the conclusion that we have approximately 35 thousandths of an inch clearance. This is slightly more than what's recommended, so we decided that we're good and we move on. Our next order of business is to find true top dead center and set up our degree wheel to read 0 when that occurs. To do this, we first need to visually set up the degree wheel as close as possible to 0 when we see the piston at top dead center by looking through the spark plug hole. We tighten the bolt holding the degree wheel onto the engine at this point to fix it to the crankshaft. Then, we rotate the engine 90 degrees forward, so the piston begins to move back down into the cylinder after top dead center, and screw in the stopper. Next, we rotate the engine backwards so the piston is moving back up towards top dead center until it bumps into the stopper and stops. We note the reading on the degree wheel, which was 34 degrees. With the stopper still in place, we rotate the engine forward this time, moving the piston down towards bottom dead center and past until it continues back up and hits the stopper. We note the reading on the degree wheel at 33 degrees. We are looking for equal readings on both sides of the 0 mark on the degree wheel. To achieve this, we set up the wheel while it stopped at this position so that it reads 33.5 degrees. Now we have successfully set up the degree wheel so that it reads 33.5 degrees after top dead center and 33.5 degrees before top dead center when it's stopped by the stopper. 0 splits the difference between these 2 degree readings, and we now have our wheel set up so that when the piston is at top dead center, it will read 0 degrees on the degree wheel.
So with the stock cam, there's a little sort of Mickey Mousey looking hole there, which should allow the cam lobes, you can actually see it here, the cam lobes should be able to go through those little spaces, but unfortunately they don't, because the cam profile is so much different than the stock one. and you can probably see it on the video. It won't go on because this little corner is in the way. So on this particular motor, on this particular date and time, we're going to have to modify the sprocket slightly by grinding this little corner off just enough to get it so that it will slide on. So, you know, once again, if you change one thing in an engine, you often have to change many other things. So in this case, we just have to grind that off. So I'll do that, and then I'll show you how it fits, and we can keep going. As I explained, we had a problem with this not being able to go on, and although I really didn't want to touch this side because there's so little material there, I wasn't able to remove enough from this side to get it to go in, so I had to take a small little nick off here. So yeah, that was the problem. It was tight here and tight here. Alright, so anyway, that solved that problem. By just very carefully grinding out a little bit of material, I was able to compensate for the extra material on the cam lobes.
Okay guys, so we have the engine assembled all the way up to where we have the camshaft in and the rocker arms and everything, and we got to do some vital measuring on the valves and the piston clearances and everything like that. So Jeff's just going to take us through exactly what we're looking for here. And as you can see, the engine here, we have everything set up, and this is again a dry assembly, so we don't have any rings in the pistons for easy movement, and we have some easy or light springs on the valves to help those move up and down easily. So Jeff's just going to take us through exactly what we're looking for here.
Okay, so the first measurement we're going to show is to verify that there's the minimum 60 thousandths of an inch clearance between the valve face, which goes here, and the piston top. Okay, so the valve's going in and out this way, the piston's going up and down this way. I've set the motor up in a position where the piston and the valve face are as close as they're going to get. And what I did was I moved the engine back and forth, turned the crank back and forth, and in this particular engine you are actually able to look in the piston or the spark plug hole and to actually see the valve and the piston inside the combustion chamber.
It's a little tough to see, but trust us, you can see it.
You can see it. So what I've done is rock the motor back and forth until I see the valve come out as far as it's going to, and the piston up as high as it's going to give us the minimum amount of clearance available between the two surfaces. So I have that basically set. I'm just going to turn the motor slightly more to get it closer, and in this particular engine it does happen right at about top dead center, the closest clearance. So now, because I have the light springs on the valve, I'm actually able to push the valve down and have it touch the top of the piston. So what I'm going to do here is slowly bring the dial indicator gauge down until it touches the top of the valve. You can see it's touching right there. Basically, it's just starting to move the valve now, so I can move it all the way around to here. So we've actually got 95 thousandths of an inch before the valve touches the top of the piston. That's when it comes right here. It's actually touching the top of the piston, and at this point it's starting to move at this point, and then it actually touches right there. Okay.
Wow, so
now
that's a lot of clearance.
One thing, when you do something like this, is that, you know, this is a valid way of attaching this to the engine in order to get the measurements on the gauge, but it does move. I mean, you see when I touch this, it's moving. So when you do this kind of thing, you have to be very gentle and try not to move anything in order to keep your measurements accurate.
Right.
The bottom line of this measurement is that we need to have a minimum of 60 thousandths of an inch clearance, And we have in fact got 95 thousandths of an inch clearance, so we have a good safety margin there. And so what that tells us is this motor is safe to run because there's enough clearance between the valve face and the piston pocket. And that's what we're looking for. So we've measured that.
Great.
Now that we've verified that there's sufficient clearance between the valve and the piston, the next thing we have to do is verify that the cam is installed in the correct relationship to the cam, or to the crank, I'm sorry. So what I have here is I have the engine set up so that the piston is going up in the cylinder and it's heading towards top dead center. Okay, and I have the indicator, dial indicator, sitting on the valve retainer to let us know when the valve starts to move and when it comes up onto the cam lobe. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn it to about here, and then okay, so when you look at the dial, the valve starts to move at 0, so I'm just past where it's starting to move, and then you have to open the valve 40 thousandths of an inch to do the degree measurement to ensure that the cam is installed correctly in relation to the crank. So I'm going to turn the motor over and set the valve opening to 40 thou.
So that would be 60 on the gauge. You can, I'm not sure if you can see it in red, but it does actually say 40 in red. But
okay, well yeah, we're going backwards.
Yeah, but same thing.
So what we need is 40 thousandths movement.
So he's just making sure he's just tapping it on the top of the head, just to make sure it's sitting
of the valve
flush
retainer. Yeah.
Of the valve retainer, yeah.
Okay, so there we go. We've got our 40 thou of movement on the valve, and now when we come around here and check, you can see that the valve is starting to open at 35 degrees, and you can see right there. Now, it's set, the nominal figure is 37 degrees before top dead center. So what that means is that the cam is sitting 1 degree this way from where it should be in the cam sprocket, and that's virtually nothing. That could easily be explained by the fact that there's a little bit of slop in the holes in the cam sprocket. So what this does is verify that the cam is installed in the correct place in relation to the crank. And what I'll do when I'm final assembling the engine is I'll make sure that I preload the cam in this direction so that it's as far as it can go advanced when I put the bolts in and tighten them up. And I'm pretty confident that that will take up the slight difference in degrees that we have here. Now, if you were to do this check and you discovered that the number of degrees where the valve is starting to open was considerably either side of where it should be, then you would have to get a slotted cam sprocket in order to be able to move the cam in relation to the crank and get this figure to be correct. So in a nutshell, what it means is that we're good. We've got good clearance between the valve and the piston top. We have verified that the cam is installed correctly, and so now we'll do the number 2 cylinder as well to verify that it's the same. However, it really can't be any different because the motor's symmetrical. Everything's the same size and everything like that. And so that's what you have to do.
Cool.
To make sure that the cam is installed correctly.
So after we check the second cylinder, we're going to tear down the whole motor again and then really start to assemble the top end for real. So we have to put the piston rings and the pistons because they're not in there. We left those out because it makes the engine a lot easier to turn over. So when you're doing this stuff, you need to move the engine back and forth. So it just helps it to slide up and down or to rotate the engine a lot easier. So basically we have to take everything apart. It took us a lot of time to get this all back together. We had some clearance issues with the chain. It was very tight on the camshaft, sprocket and everything, but we got it together. It's coming together. So I think we're gonna take it apart now and start putting it back together do we need to check anything else, Jeff?
Deck height's fine. We've done the true top dead center check, it's fine. Yeah, one thing we do have to do is determine how many shims we have to put underneath the spark plug. And the reason why that is because this is a 12.5 to 1 compression piston, so the piston dome is sticking way up inside the combustion chamber. Yeah. And because of that, the stock spark plug tip will hit the piston. So in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, which would not be good, believe me, is we need to try 2 or 3 different sizes of shims to get the spark plug shimmed out of the way enough that it's not going to actually be touching the piston.
Cool.
That's not good. So we have to do that. Okay, so we have checked the installed spring height, and it's good. We've checked for coil bind, and that's fine. There's lots of room. The valve the retainer to the top of the valve guide clearance, we've checked that as well, and it's okay.
Cool.
The piston to valve head clearance, we actually demonstrated that. The other thing that's important is making sure that the cam's thrust tolerance is correct. So how far the cam can move side to side within the head.
Okay. And
so we used feeler gauges with the cam pushed all the way to one side in order to determine. Then the little shims actually go right in here on either side of the cam.
Okay.
And they're stock with the stock motor. So we measured. I wrote it down. 26 thousandths of an inch clearance with a feeler gauge, and then I measured the shims, and they stacked up to equal 12 thousandths of an inch. So that in effect gives us a 14 thousandths of an inch thrust clearance, and the spec is from 8 thousandths to 24. So basically we're sitting right in the middle of the range. That's perfect.
Cool.
We verified that the cam, we've degreed the cam to verify that it's installed correctly.
Right.
And so really those are all the measurements that we need to verify to be safety SAMs.
Cool. Okay, so so we're gonna get going with this stuff. We're gonna disassemble, and then we have to check a few more things, but after that we should be ready to assemble the engine.
Here we are on day 45. It's not that bad. We have run into a couple of problems, but they're actually typical of what you end up running into when you're doing this kind of thing. We ended up having to order a few parts that we hadn't and so on, but it's all come together. So last time out we spent the time to go through all the clearance checks that we needed to do because we're building a high performance motor, and as with all things, when you change one thing, everything downstream has to be changed and or checked. So we've completed our list here of clearances that we need to do. We've checked them all. They're all within range. The only thing we still have to do is to do the spark plug shimming, but that can be done once the head is complete, or the top end is completely assembled. So it's good. Everything's going to work properly, and it's all recorded for posterity. I went ahead and disassembled the top end in order to save some time, and I have everything that we need all set up here. I've gone ahead and replaced the tack drive seal, which goes in here, and that's a really simple procedure. It's just a matter of taking a pair of pliers and pulling the shaft out, clean it up, put the new seal in, and then use a 10 millimeter deep socket like this in order to gently tap it back into place. Then this is the point side cover, and once again I've put a new seal in there and used a big 30 millimeter socket in my press to install that. So it's all good to go, as they say. We've pre-assembled the cam chain tensioner, So it's withdrawn all the way in, ready to do its tensioning job. And then I have all the pieces here laid out in an organized fashion so that we don't miss anything. And so what we're going to do now is assemble the top end. First thing we need to do is put the rings on the pistons, install the pistons, and we need to put these O-rings on the cylinders. That's super important, because if you don't put those on, then you're going to find that the cylinders leak oil. Eventually it'll start to travel up the outside of the cylinder sleeves. So it's important to get those in there now. So the original ones are still in here. So I'm going to pull the original ones out, and you can tell they're no good because they're all square and they should be round. It's always very wise for that exact reason right there, to replace O-rings all the time. I realize it's $2, but it's $2 very well spent in the end. And the thing is that when you're this far into it, it only makes sense to replace everything while you're in there, because you know, Murphy's Law tells you that guaranteed 100 miles after you put it together, if you don't, something's going to start leaking or whatever. So it's a good idea to clean out the groove. Those go in. So once again, it is my practice to use my favorite grease, Valve waterproof grease, on all this kind of stuff. Putting a little bit of grease on the O-ring is going to help keep it supple over time. Plus, it also allows it to squeeze into the groove better. Now, you have to make sure when you put this on that you don't roll the O-ring, because if it's twisted when it gets down to the bottom there, it's not going to really seal properly. And then you have to carefully press it into the groove here, all the while trying not to stretch it, because if you're not careful, you'll end up with a big loop on one side.
Before we install the piston rings, we need to check ring end gap. We come to the conclusion that there is 12 thousandths of an inch clearance between the ring ends. The minimum is 10.5 thousandths of an inch, so we are good and can move on.
So now on to piston rings. So we'll start off with number 1. And the first rings, first of all, you should always check and make sure that the ring grooves are all in nice shape, and that there isn't anything stuck in them, no dents or anything like that. So it looks good. Now I've pre-installed the first piston pin circlip because it makes it easier to do when it's on the bench rather than sitting in the engine, and that way you only have to put on the one outside circlip when we put it together. Okay, so the first rings to go on are the oil control rings, and they're made up out of 3 parts. So you have the expander, and then you have a top and a bottom rail. Now when you're installing rings, you always have to look at the right beside where the gap is, and you always install them with the number or the letter facing up. Now on the oil control ring, there generally is never any indication, so they can go either way. But the reason why you have to make sure that you put the rings on with the, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that, but there's an N right there. Oh, can you see that? There's an N there, and then on the other side there isn't. And although right off the top of my head I don't know if that's the case with these rings, the reason why you have to do that is not all rings are square on the face. Some of them have a taper on the outside, some of them have a taper on the inside, or the top and bottom surface can also be tapered. It just depends on the kind of ring. Okay. But basically speaking, as long as you make sure you've got the letter or the number at the gap up, then you're laughing. Now the other thing too is how to recognize the compression rings. Generally speaking, nowadays the top compression ring will be a chrome ring, which looks like this. You can see there's an obvious difference between them. And then this is a cast iron second compression ring. So they go in like this with the oil control on the bottom. And you know, if you're not sure, check the factory manual. That's your best friend. That and a parts fiche to verify you're putting everything in the right place. Okay, so in order to put the oil control ring on, what we do is first we put the expander ring on, and it's very important that when you do this, now can you, I'm not sure if you can see that, they do not go like that. They have to butt against each other like that. And it can be a little tricky sometimes to get the first ring on, or the first ring on, because it tends to want to jump like this. So just be careful and check, double check when you're doing it. This goes on, okay, we've marked our piston for orientation, so that's forward. And so at the back of the piston, you want to put the gap in the expander ring at the back. So you need to put it on like that. Just slide it around gently like this. Some people like to use ring expanders to do this. I've been doing it just using my hands forever, and it works just fine. So you can see right here, those have to just butt against each other. See, they're just butting against each other. Yeah. You don't want them to be on top. Alright, so that's the expander ring. So then, and I always put the gap right in the middle at the back of the piston. Then the next ring on is this one here, the bottom rail, and I like to separate the gaps so that the bottom one's here and the top one's here. You can do it either way, it doesn't really matter. The main thing is that you have the gaps for the oil ring this far apart. Okay, so once again, this can be a little bit tricky. If you sort of hold your thumb over where the gap is, you can slide this ring around, and then what I do is I just hook my fingernail on the edge and very carefully pull it across until it lands where it's supposed to go. Now you can, well, I can see you, I'm not sure if you can see it, but the gap on the lower ring is here. The expander ring is touching each other right there.
Show me the gap on the lower ring again.
Sorry, right here.
Okay.
And then you can see they're touching each other there.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you have to, you know, use a magnifying glass or something. This makes an amazing help to your eye, especially when you get old like me. So then the top rail, once again, I'm putting the gap over on this side here, and then just wind it around your fingernail on there and carefully drop it in. Now, once you've got it assembled, so the top and bottom gap are where my fingernails are, and then the expander gap is in here. Now, once you've got it installed, if it's installed properly, you'll be able to move it in the groove, and you'll be able to turn it. If you don't have those rails installed quite correctly, you'll find that it gets jammed in there, so that's kind of like a quick double check to make sure you've got it. Now, once these rings get in the engine, they move around, like the rings rotate. The reason why they tell you to put the gaps away from each other is really just to help you on initial startup, right, and so on. But once the motor's running, the rings actually do rotate around in the grooves. Then the next one on is the second compression ring. So we'll make sure we've got the letter up, and then once again, what I do is slide it in the groove like that, and then just twist it around, and then hook my fingernail on there, and then just pull it apart just enough to get it past, like that. And there you go, because you don't want to stretch the rings too much. So I always put that gap at about 2 o'clock or so, if this is a clock. And then the next one is the top compression ring, once again number at the top, and stick the ring in like that, twist it around, very gently open it up just enough to get it past, and there you go. So now we'll, as they call it, clock the rings. So now we've got the gaps. There's a top ring gap at about 10, second ring gap at about 2, and then your oil expander ring right here. So those 2 gaps at, I don't know, 4 and 8 o'clock, and the expander ring at 6 o'clock.
Perfect.
So there, that's the pistons now ready to go in. And once we get it installed, then we'll be using these piston ring compressors here. Now these are actually a Honda tool. I've had these for 25 years now. And the reason why I like to use these ones is because when you install the piston, once it's installed in the cylinder, you can expand them out and get them out of the way. Unfortunately, this kind of a ring expander doesn't actually work because you can't really remove it once you've got the piston up into the cylinder.
Right.
So these are meant more for like putting pistons into a 350 Chevy or something like that, where you can put the piston and the rod down through the top and then connect it onto the crank from the bottom. Doesn't work on motorcycle engines. So then basically just rinse and repeat on number 2.
So we're going to do the second ring here, and then we'll be back once we're ready to install these into the engine.
Yeah. So now we're ready to put the pistons onto the connecting rods. And so in order to do that, we need to, I like to install the base gasket before I put the pistons on, because it's often a lot easier to put it on now than trying to wiggle it past the rings and everything when the pistons are on. It's not so bad on a twin, but when you've got a 4 or a CBX 6-cylinder or something, it can be a real bugger. Something I highly recommend you do with all these are called knock pins by the factory, or locating pins by everybody else. I always put a little smear of grease on them before I install them, and always make sure that you clean them up and get rid of any, like if you've had to use a pair of pliers in heat to get them out because they're rusted, there can be, you know, gouges and stuff. You can reuse them, but you have to file the gouges and stuff off to make sure they're nice and smooth and round again. So I just put a little bit of grease on there. It's not going to help us, but if somebody ever has to take the motor back apart, it pretty much guarantees that you're not going to end up with the pins seized like they all are, because the factory doesn't do that, and they're always not a whole lot of fun to get out. Now we've got the knock pins in. Those are really important. They locate the cylinder so that everything's all nice and square and in the correct location. Then the next thing on is going to be the base gasket, and in this case,
in our particular situation,
yes, because we're building such a wicked high performance engine here, we ended up having to use 2 base gaskets in order to raise the cylinder up to make sure that the tops of the pistons were in the correct place and that it gave us the proper amount of clearance between the top of the piston at the squish band and the combustion chamber of the cylinder head. And always make sure you look at the gasket and orient it correctly, because often there'll be holes for oil galleries and stuff in these kind of parts, so gaskets. So I'll make sure that they're going on the right way. Oh, come on. Alright, and then Mr. Cam chain tensioner. Come on, come on. And all the while I'm trying to make sure that these little rubber pads don't jump out and go galley west. There we go, just make sure everything's all nice and even. Little rubber things, there's a gap for the cam chain slider right there. If you just let this hang down a little bit, it'll stay off the crank and it'll allow you to turn it while still keeping it out of the way. So you see now it's kind of hanging down off the sprocket, which is good. That'll allow us to move the crank around. So that's what this here is. It's just engine oil, basically. And now, some people say don't, some people say do. I think it's a good idea to just lubricate the rings a little bit. Make sure that there's oops, I'm throwing stuff around. Okay, so just throw a little bit of oil in there and then swing the rings around. Make sure there's lots of oil in there. Now, what I'm going to do is move the rings back where they should be again. And we'll use some assembly lube on here. And a little bit on the pin. And once again, make sure your hands are relatively clean because we don't want to be getting horrible goo. I'm just going to slide that through there, make sure we got lots of lubrication going on. As I said, I've already pre-installed the other piston circlip because it's a lot easier to put it on now than when the piston's in there. So then just drop the piston down. You get down and look through the pin, you can see the hole in the rod and line it up. Just kind of wiggle stuff a bit and there she goes. Alright, so that's nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick a rag in here underneath the piston to make sure that if I do slip or drop the piston circlip, it's not going to go down into the bottom of the engine. We'd probably be able to find it, but it's a lot easier to just cover it up than to try and go fishing for a little tiny part inside your engine. So one thing that you have to really be careful of is that you don't scratch the bore where the pin goes through. Alright, so it just snapped into place there. What I basically try and do is make sure that the gap in the circlip is up or in the top portion here. And the reason I do that is because that way, if you ever have to take this out, there's a little groove here that you can get your plier underneath and pop that out. If you put the gap right there, you can't get it back out again. And
good tip.
So I just always make sure the gap's up the top here.
Cool.
And really, if you've got luck on your side that day, you can really pretty much just push them in there. There's not that much spring tension on that clip.
Cool.
And then double, triple, quadruple check that it's actually sitting right in the groove all the way around. And I've done that, and it looks good. And when you're turning the crank, once you've got the pistons on, always make sure that you don't get the slipper or the bottom of the piston caught, because it's very easy to bend these. And so once the pistons are on, when you're turning the motor over, just be really careful you don't get it caught and dent or bend anything. You may have actually been able to hear that little snap when it popped into the groove.
Yes.
That's kind of what you're looking for. And then just visually inspect and make sure that you've got it completely into the groove, because if it's not going to be a happy thing. And put your gap up in the top portion of the bore.
Right.
We've had the pistons running up and down inside the cylinders with no rings on for a little while here, and so what I'm doing is I'm just taking a clean rag and making sure that the insides of the cylinders are nice and clean. If you put it up to the light and then just look through it, you can actually, the light will reflect off the cylinder walls and you can make sure you got all the dirt off. So it's good. Cleanliness, cleanliness, cleanliness. You only get one chance to make sure you put the engine together clean, so.
Yes.
Let me move this out of the way for a second so you can see what I'm doing here. So the first thing we have to do after we've made sure everything's nice and clean is to install the cam chain slipper for the front. So it sits in the engine kind of like that, and this goes into a groove on the top like that, and then it's kept from falling out on the other side with this pin right here. Yeah, it's tight because there's rubber in the hole there. So just make sure that it's equidistant one side to the other. There is space in the groove on the engine, but you have to make sure it's pretty much equidistant, and that then gets captured in the top of the engine case in case if we're moving around. We've got our O-rings, got our cam slider in there.
And this is a brand new part that we replaced. The original one had groove lines in it, and it just was not up to standard to put it back in the engine. So Jeff was very adamant about me replacing that, which we did. So it's all good.
Yeah,
brand new part.
I'll show you the old part. So this is the old part, and this is exactly what happens to this particular part. Actually, two things. This is like partly made out of rubber, and it is just as hard as a hockey puck. So it's no longer really doing its damping job like it should. Plus, you can literally see that the cam chain has worn grooves in it. If you look at the new one is nice and smooth and flat, and you can actually feel it's rubbery, whereas this one is just, you know, it's as hard as a hockey puck. You know, if you were to put this back in the engine, basically you're putting a worn out part in that's going to mean that your cam chain system will have more slack than it would with the new parts. And besides, it's just logical to put new parts in while you're there. I mean, with any luck, you'll never have to take this engine apart. So it makes sense to replace as you go. The last thing I'm going to do before I start putting the cylinder on is clean up my hands. And then I'm just going to take and this is just ordinary kind of 1030 motor oil. Put a little bit in there and just rub it around. This is actually for the benefit of the engine when it's first started up, and if it does happen to be sitting around for a while before it's run, it'll keep them from rusting as well. So just get it all spread around in there real nice. Put a little bit on here, keep that from... Yeah, the whole idea is just to get a good coat of oil on there. Make sure everything's all lubed up and sliding nice. Okay, now these here, just make sure they're good and square and that the rings are all actually going into the grooves, not twisting or bending. Okay, so first we thread that cam chain through, and then make sure you get the cylinder over all the studs, and then I'm gonna slide it down, feeding the cam chain through. And if you tilt the cylinders towards the back, they'll kind of stick on the studs, so you can lower it down slowly. And I'm doing this single-handed, so. Alrighty, now the trick is to hold the cylinder, hold the pistons, hold the... Oh shit, I don't have my glasses on. Okay, and then when you get old, you gotta stop and put your glasses on so you can see. And, alright, now. Okay. Alright, I got it. What I'm doing is just slowly kind of tapping the cylinder down onto the pistons. Run out of room now here. And I'm also checking around the whole piston to make sure that the rings are not getting caught on anything.
That is a tight squeeze.
Okay, so now just before I actually put it down, I want to quadruple check that the cam chain tensioner is sitting where it's supposed to be. We've got our base gasket, we've got our slipper, knock pins. O-rings on the bottom of the cylinders. Cam chain tensioner looks like it's where it's supposed to be. Ho, ho, ho.
Looking good.
All right. Beautiful. I like to just take a rag and sort of take that really big excess amount of oil that's at the top of the combustion chamber out. There's still oil on it, but that way it just doesn't smoke quite as much when you first start it.
Right.
And then once again, yeah, see, there's just enough on there. So it's a good idea to just make sure everything turns freely. And that is beautiful. Once again, I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on the knock pins to keep them from rusting so that the next person in here won't have to fist fight with them. I wish the factory would do that, but they don't. Once again, cleanliness is very important. Make sure you do a last little clean on all the surfaces. Make sure everything's that's supposed to be loose is loose, and everything that's supposed to be tight is tight. Alright, so once again, just double check your gasket. Make sure you're putting it on the right way. And in this case, the rounded nose part goes to the front, and the other one goes to the back. Okay, so there we go, head gasket, and this is a special head gasket because you're using big bore pistons. We had to get a larger head gasket because the standard one the metal ring here goes inside the cylinder, and that'll cause hot spots and all kinds of bad stuff, so that's not a good thing. So once again, just give everything a last little wipe and make sure that it's nice and clean. And I think Tony went through this before. Because he's using the aftermarket tensioner, he had to have the head machined, so you can actually see where it's been slightly relieved there, just to make sure that it's got lots of clearance and that the tensioner can move. So that's good. And then make sure you put it on the right way. So that's the intake and that's the exhaust. So we're looking at the front of the engine, so we need to make sure to do that. So we've got our knock pins, got our gasket, our cam chain here. Okay, so look underneath, make sure your studs are going into the holes. The cam chain up out of the way. And then make sure that your tensioners and everything are all where they're supposed to be going. Alright, and get down and take a look at the gap and make sure everything's all even. You probably saw it just drop down on the knock pins there, so that's good. Turn it around, make sure everything's hunky-dory. We've got the cam tensioners loose, so that's good. And everything's all nice and even there, so that's good. And then the next thing is there's two bolts that go in that hold the head to the cylinder, these right here. And once again, it's a really good practice to just put a little bit of grease on the threads of these. That helps make sure that they get the correct torque, and also means that if anybody ever has to go in there again, these won't be seized. So it's just good working practice to do that. The amount of torque required on these particular fasteners is very small, and I actually don't have a torque wrench that will go down that low, because it's only like 6 foot-pounds or something like that. But when you've been doing this as long as I have, you can, what I do is just use a small wrench, that way you can't get too much torque on it. And pounds exactly, according to the manual torque wrench. That's good. We've got the head down. It's kind of held in place by those two bolts. Just make sure that we're sitting pretty darn close to top dead center here, and then to give us the best chance of timing the engine easily. When you're putting this together, you have to have the L and this line at the top. Okay, so the line and that L go towards the left hand side of the engine. That way you can read the timing mark, and you can read, sorry, you can read the timing mark here. Yeah. And then this is the timing mark for the cam, and basically it lines up with the top surface of the cam box. So what I'm going to do is try and make sure that when I put this on, I have it in the correct place, within a tooth anyway, once we get it up there. Now, so now you can see that with this sitting at T and that there, you can pretty much see that it's parallel with this. So that's a good starting point. Okay, so we've got our knock or locating pins. I'm just double checking to make sure that my holes all line up properly. It's on the right way. That's good. Wiped off nice and clean. Alright, so the next piece to go on is this right here. This is where the cam actually sits. And something to point out on this particular one, because of the big lift cam that you're putting in, the person that did the head had to grind out to make some relief in here and here as well and here, in order to allow the big lobes on the big cam to be able to get in there. And these are tricky to put together with normal factory parts, and they're even trickier when you start putting big lobe cams and stuff in. But once again, just go slow, check everything, be patient, and it all goes together. So once again, check, make sure you're putting it on the right way. And on this motor, CB350s, the rounded part here goes to the front. So it'll go on like that. Alrighty, look at that. So now you can see our cam sprocket is inside the cam box, and just tie that off. It doesn't actually matter if the cam chain on this particular motor does happen to fall down a little ways. Because when you pull it back up, it'll re-engage with the sprocket on the crank, but it's a good idea just to keep it up there as much as possible. It makes life a little bit simpler. The cam goes in with the number one cylinder or cam lobes pointing down, so you can see this one and this one, they're pointing down. So basically, so it goes in here like that, and there's you have to turn it around and get it through the clearances. Now it goes into the now one of the problems with doing this is that the cam is restricted in how far you can turn it, and so you don't really have any choice but to move the motor. Oh, it's just right there. Okay, so we got the first lobe through.
That was a bitch!
Yes, it is extremely difficult and really takes a lot of patience, but it's worth it in the end. So we just spent 20 minutes fiddling around, and now we finally got the last lobe to go through. There we go. Alright, so that's the point at which you have joy.
Oh, it feels good.
Okay.
That took a long time.
That is actually the most difficult part of the whole darn thing, is doing that. And then
honestly, like, what is the best advice you can give there? It's hard to tell, right? You just kind of...
Well, the best advice is...
You gotta look at it.
Do a practice run installing the cam into the sprocket outside of the engine, so that you understand the relationship between the lobe and the gap, or the space, the window in the cam sprocket. Do it outside so you understand how it has to go, because in this particular case we had to put the cam in through the one window and then turn the motor 90 degrees to get the lobe to go through the same window, because I didn't want to take too much material off this sprocket. So we just took the bare minimum off it, and because of that we basically had to go through the same window. There's two windows, one for each lobe, but because of the bigger lobes it's all just really tight. So the end result of all of that is that we're Now we just have to get the lobes lined up with the windows over here, and it's definitely fun and games getting the cam in where it's supposed to go. Now that we have got it where it's supposed to go, now we can get the engine back to where it's supposed to be. Alright, the bolts that hold the cam sprocket on the cam, there's two different types, and you can probably see it here. One doesn't have a shoulder and one does have a shoulder. Okay, so this here, and the reason why they do that is because this flat surface here acts as a sort of dowel pin, so that when you install it in the sprocket, this flat part here goes completely through the metal part of the cam sprocket and slightly into the cam itself, so about that much of it is actually right inside the cam itself. And the reason they do that is it acts like a dowel pin, so it positively locates the sprocket on the cam on one side, and then the other side is simply a fastener to hold the whole assembly together.
With the crankshaft at left top dead center, the horizontal line on the cam sprocket parallel with the top of the cam box, and the pin in the camshaft at 12 o'clock, the full thread bolt goes in the top hole closest to the L mark on the sprocket.
Now, according to Hoyle and all his buddies, we should theoretically be able to turn this around like that. Again, just to make sure. So, red Loctite. Just remember, Loctite is permanent. Red Loctite is permanent. As per instructions. Alright. That will surely never move. So, now, with our LT mark right there, we have pretty nice, although it's going to be moving up, but I can tell it's not a tooth out. If it's a tooth out, it's obvious because the line will be like this or like that. Mm-hmm. And don't like it. It doesn't really mean anything because we need to get these.
Right. Exactly.
But I just did a quick check to make sure. So now our pins up, our lines there, our lines there.
All good in the hood.
The next step is that we need to put the cam shims in, and what those do is locate the cam thrust, so side to side movement, and there's a specification for it, and we measured it earlier, and we determined that by putting the two original factory shims back on the cam, it puts us right in the middle of the tolerance range, so that's perfect. And it's important that you put these on and that you check that, because that's an important clearance. It locates the cam side to side, which is going to make sure that the cam chain runs straight on the sprocket. Basically, I've marked all the rocker arms for their original position, so I know where they go. We're putting new O-rings on, so they go on like that, and then just put a little drop of stuff on there. Make sure we got good lubrication when it first starts up. And I'm going to do this, the number 1 cylinder first because the lobes are down, and then rocker shaft goes in like that. Now, CB350s are a little different than a lot of bikes in that they don't actually have an adjuster screw and lock nut on the valve side of the rocker arm here. The way they're adjusted, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this or not, is as I turn this shaft, you can see that the rocker arm is actually moving up and down because there's an eccentric on it. So the manual says there's a very small little line on one side of the screwdriver slot here, which I can hardly, okay, right there. The manual says to put all the rocker shafts so that that line is pointing towards the outside of the engine. So this one would point this way, that one would point that way, and it's really only important because it means that all the CB350s, when you're adjusting the valve clearance, it operates in a 180-degree circle facing towards the outside, just so that you can, it makes it standard. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set the eccentric so that it's up at the top so that I get the most amount of valve clearance. That gives me more room to work to lift the cam up and get it into the bearings. It's all wonderful. So now intake side goes in. Once again, just spin stuff as you put it on and make sure you've got your line pointing to the outside. And once again, I'm moving it up as high as I can on the eccentric, which actually the most amount of valve lash would be with the line pointing straight up. Okay, so O-rings on there, good. Two. Now this is probably going to be where it gets hard to do. Alrighty. I've never turned it completely over all the way with all the valves opening, with all the spring pressure. And when these rockers come up on those lobes, man, you can feel it. Like it sort of feels like there's something wrong, but it's because the big honking valves. So I'm trying to be careful and slow the first time. Okay, so there we go. See, this is good. Wow. This thing ain't gonna idle below 2,000 RPM. The lumpiness I can feel in it. Yeah. Oh, yummy. I'm gonna make sure that we've got timing marks all lined up, which they should still be theoretically, but.
Okay, so recap here. We've bolted on the head, the cam box case here.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the side covers all torqued up.
That's correct.
The bolts in the cam sprocket are torqued.
And Loctited with red Loctite. Yep, rockers are installed. Right now, they're sitting so that they have clearance, which is important because you can't get it together if you don't have all of them sitting so that there's as much clearance as possible.
Yeah. And we've ensured the timing is correct, the left timing mark is on point, the line on the sprocket is
parallel to this
the
surface.
surface, and the little pin on the camshaft is pointing in the sky, pointing north. So
that's correct.
We're good.
That is absolutely. So what we're going to do next is I'll adjust the valve clearances, and then once that's done, then we'll put the cover on and torque the whole thing down and put the caps on, and that's pretty much the top end together at that point. Yay!
Sounds good, man.
Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do here is adjust the valves, the clearance. So that means to take up the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve right here. And that's done by turning this shaft, which has an eccentric on it. And actually,
for the people who don't know what that is, really explain what an eccentric is.
Okay, an eccentric shaft is it has two circles and one is offset from the other. So when you turn the shaft, what it does is, I'll actually show you and you should be able to see it. When I turn this, you can see that the arm is moving up and down. See how it's moving?
Yeah.
Because there's an eccentric circle
I see.
that's offset from the center line of the shaft here. And so by turning that, what you do, I'll move the shaft, you can hear that?
Yeah.
And as I turn it,
It's less
and now there's no clearance, right? And then, so if I go the other way, you can hear now it's getting bigger and bigger. So that, on this particular motor, that's how the valve lash or clearance is adjusted. On most other motors, there's actually a screw and a lock nut right on the end of the rocker arm. Mm-hmm. So you actually adjust it out here, mm-hmm. But you know, this is an innovative motor, so they've done it a little differently. So it's really easy to do. What you do is put your feeler gauge, this is a 5/1000 of an inch feeler gauge.
So that's what spec is.
That's right, and that's larger than the standard specification. If I remember off the top of my head correctly, it's supposed to be 2 and 3 thou, so 2 thou for the intake and 3 for the exhaust, or something like that. It could be 3 or 4. Check your manual, but it's something like that. But they allow more clearance with a performance engine like this because it gets hotter. And the reason for clearance is to allow the engine parts to expand and contract. It can be a real problem if you have too tight a clearance, because when everything warms up, it can start holding the valve open. And when that happens, then, you know, on the exhaust side, it's really bad, because if it's being held open by 1/1000th or 2/1000ths of an inch, it allows the hot exhaust gases to leak past the valve, and it will literally burn a trench right in the face of the valve in no time at all if they're being held open. The technique for doing this is that you turn the shaft until you get a slight drag when you're pulling the...
So you're tightening it with your right hand and
yeah,
pulling it with
exactly.
your left.
So like basically I'm turning it this way to tighten it, and I can, by just moving that as I turn this slowly, all of a sudden I can start to feel drag on that. So that's the easy part. The hard part now is that you have to take a wrench and tighten the lock nut, which keeps it from moving. But when you do that, and this is actually the same, sorry, I have to do it this way, the same technique you would use for a screw and lock nut on this end, you have to put pressure in the opposite direction on the screw, on the slot headed shaft, to counteract the pressure you put when you tighten the lock nut. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm putting pressure this way on the wrench, and I'm putting pressure that way on the slotted part of the screw. Right. So I'm counteracting this. The reason you have to do that is because if you didn't have the screwdriver in there, when you're tightening this, it's going to back off the shaft.
Right.
And so now, this is where the experience part comes. See, now that I've done that, it's actually tightened it up too much. So what I'm going to have to do is undo the lock nut, slightly back off this, and then try it again. Now see, it's a little bit loose, so I'm actually doing this just for effect.
You can see that. That should be it.
There. Now you see, that was the first one. As I go around, by the time I get to the last one, I'll probably be able to just do it right off the bat. But it's like so many things when you do this, there's a feel involved in it. Alright, so this is a not uncommon thing to have to remember to take care of all the time when you put high compression, high dome pistons in engines like this, when you're building a killer motor like that. The problem is that because you'll probably remember from when you could see the tops of the pistons, there's a big honking triangle poking out of the top of the piston. And the reason for that is to fill up the combustion chamber, and that's what gives you your 12.5:1 compression ratio. But the problem is, because now there's all that aluminum sticking up inside the combustion chamber, the spark plug is now going to touch the top of the piston, and that's not good. So what we need to do is you always use a spacer to space the spark plug out, and that's what we're going to go through doing right now, is to find out if one of these or whether we need two. I had also made a suggestion that maybe you could go to a surface fire spark plug. So instead of having the ground electrode sticking out like that, a surface fire has the electrode coming out from the side, and the spark plug is only this long instead of having the ground electrode poking out. And unfortunately I didn't get any into the shop, so we can't check that, but that's something you might want to look into.
Okay. So, and how exactly do you check if it's going to be clear? Just basically put the spark plug in and turn the motor?
Yeah, no, the instructions say that you have to shim it. So I'm going to just assume that it's going to hit no matter what. So rather than potentially damaging anything, I'm going to put a shim on. And first things first, that needs a little bit of lube on these threads. That's something that you should always do, is when you put spark plugs in, you should always put just a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. I do that all the time. And you don't want to get it up on this end, but putting a little bit on there will go a long way to making sure that you never end up with a spark plug seized in the spark plug hole. Okay, that bodes well.
So he's just turning over the engine to make sure nothing's binding here.
Okay, well, it went right over top dead center without any problem. We should be coming up on LT there. Yeah, we're good.
So one shim is
so one of these. Now, what I'm using here is actually just a drain plug, an aluminum drain plug washer, but that's effective, and you can reuse it over and over again.
So we're all shimmed up.
Okay, so then that'll be fine on the other side as well. And I know from now working on this engine that it's equal on both sides. So if that works on one, it'll work on the other.
Sweet.
Now, so the last thing we have to do to get the top end together is to put the cover on. This is the cap that goes on, and this basically seals the engine. And then these are the 8 fasteners that will be torquing down, which torque the head and the cylinders and everything all down. It also functions as a crankcase breather mechanism. So what happens here is, okay, so basically what happens here is you can see that there's a labyrinth here, a labyrinth. What that means is that the spray of oil that's happening inside the top of the head has to go through a maze kind of thing. And by doing that, it knocks the oil particles out of the air stream, and it allows the small amount of smoke and so on to go out here, which then gets the crank gases to be able to escape. And the whole reason why you need a crank breather system is because no matter what you do, even in the most perfectly built engine, there's always going to be blow-by past the piston rings, and it pressurizes the crankcase. And if you don't allow the engine to breathe, so to release that pressure, it will build up and it will blow the seals out of the engine. And I've actually seen many cases in my life working on these things where somebody has not properly routed the hose that comes off of the crank breather, and it's gotten pinched, and it's allowed the engine to pressurize itself, and you know, the thing leaks oil like there was no tomorrow, and it's really not a seal problem. It's because the crank breather hose is kinked and bent. So anyway, so then this plate goes on, and the reason for the plate is because when you put this down here, you can see that there's deflectors here, and those help to direct the oil that's spraying around in the top here so that it drips on important places in the engine to lubricate them, because all the lubrication that's going on up at the top of the engine here is basically drip lubrication. So oil gets to the bearings on either end of the cam through holes that are in these caps and feeds in there, and then you can literally see the holes in the rocker arms right here, and the oil, you know, lands there and seeps through and comes out here. And so these little bumps on here are meant to control the oil and make sure that it gets to the places it's supposed to, and then the gases go out here and then work their way around the labyrinth and come out the hose there. So because of this plate, which is important for controlling the oil, then you... Oh, wait a minute. I've put this in... yeah, sorry, I've got the I've got the gaskets on backwards, which is okay as long as you recognize it. There we go. Yeah. So that's that. Right. So that's actually how they go. So you've got this one and the plate, and then the solid one on top. You can see on the top of the engine here that there's a small hole right there, and that's probably really important, or they wouldn't have put it there. So when you put the gasket on, make sure that the holes line up. So you've got a hole there, and then, oops, so now we put the cover on, once again, hole, make sure it lines up. And I can tell you for a fact that this is the most unbelievably crazy thing to take apart and get the gasket material off of.
Oh yeah.
I think it's because it's sitting right at the top of the engine, so it's
bakes
like,
it right on, doesn't it?
It's unbelievable. I invent new 4-letter words every time I do that because it's crazy. Okay, it's all done. There you go.
Okay, bud.
Oh, wait a minute. Let's put the pretty stuff on. Once you've got the cover on, then the last thing we need to do here is to torque these 8 beautiful acorn nuts down. And what that does is torque everything that's from here up properly. And that's a very important step. So according to the manual, we need to use a cross hatch pattern when we do it in order to torque it up evenly. So the whole idea is that you should do them in a crosshatch pattern, working from the inside out. That's the rule of thumb for torquing
1, 2, 3,
heads.
4. And if you want a reference, here's the book here. You can see it.
It's been a long day.
I know it has been a long day, and this is backwards, so we have the engine the other way. So excuse us if we're a little tired.
But
working on this bad boy for a month.
The main thing is it's done right, and so. Alrighty. So which one's number 1 again?
This one.
Okay, and then as with all torquing operations, what you want to do is work up to the final torque. So we'll just give it a little bit of tension right now and slowly work up to it. Okay, now this is the best part of building an engine. You get to hug it. Okay, so 1, 2.
No, 3 is down, yeah.
Now, you can see that we're really turning these fasteners a lot. But that's because we have to compress the 2 gaskets here, the head gasket, this gasket, those 2 gaskets, as well as stretch the studs as well. And then what I'll do is, come on, okay. Do you hear that? That means that it's reached full torque when it makes that noise. And I'm just going to do it a couple of times. And you'll notice that when I'm coming up to the torque, I keep a constant force until it clicks and then stop. That way you're getting a true torque reading. I think we actually went through that when we were torquing the bottom end and stuff, but it's a good idea now. Now, you can hear me doing it a bunch of times, and I'll tell you why. It's because as I pull on this, I can feel that big long stud twisted. And every time I go and give it a little click like that, I can feel that the fastener is just turning a little bit more. So I always feel better if I do that 3 or 4 times just to make sure that it's actually going to be at the right torque when the stud flexes back to its normal position. You can actually feel that if you want to do this. If you hug your new motor and just pull slowly.
Hi, baby. How are you?
You see how you can actually feel it twisting slightly, and then it snaps. Cool. And so by just over time, I realized that if you do that 4 or 5 times, then it. So there we go. That's that torqued up to spec.
Very cool. Okay, guys. So we've buttoned the engine up, just torqued up the engine here. He's done an awesome job. It's all done. I'm like friggin' losing my mind here because it's just so nice to see this come together, to learn how this engine works. I know everything in my head now. I know every little piece in this engine and how it works, and that's going to benefit me going forward. Really take care of this bike and make sure it's running properly. And just done a fantastic job of putting this together, making sure everything's sound, everything that has been checked for clearance. It's going to run, well. So thank you, Jeff. You've done an awesome job. We'll switch hands to give you a handshake because it's been an absolute pleasure coming to your shop. It's been I think you guys have learned a lot. I've learned a shit ton. Just coming here, hanging out with you and watching the way you work, and you're an awesome mechanic, and it's a pleasure to watch you work, and it's a pleasure to, have you work on my engine and teach me this stuff and show other people, what we have here. So thank you very much, and it's been a real pleasure, and thanks for having me in your shop, man.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I've had a real good time as well doing this with you.
Yeah.
It's been a great experience for me. I'm just beyond pleased with the first 2 videos, and the next ones that are coming. You do a great job of all the editing and everything.
Cool.
I think it's a fantastic expose of my talents.
Absolutely.
And so I think, you know, all in all, it's a win-win situation for both of us. And I hope that YouTubers are going to be able to get some good information out of here.
I think you will, for sure, yeah.
Now, the only thing I'd like to say is that don't forget, we didn't do a how-to video here.
Exactly.
This is a video that basically covers the process from beginning to end. I know for a fact that there's some...
my particular engine. Right?
Yes. Now, granted, the techniques that I've shown here are applicable to any engine, really. You know, for example, greasing threads when you put fasteners back together. That's something that you should always do, because it just means that when you have to take it apart again, things aren't going to get seized and so on. Frankly, I wish the factory would do that, but they're not in the business of, you know, they want to sell you parts, so not have it come apart easily. Anyway, so, you know, what we've shown applies to building any kind of engine. I just want to make sure you understand that it's not a how-to, it's just about the process. And, you know, a wise man knows his limitations. And so, you know, Tony was smart enough to know that when he started looking at the manual that this was probably above his head. However, I know that if you were to do this again, you could probably handle doing this job again yourself. Because, you know, I've been able to impart enough information to you that you should be able to do it again. However, you know, he's a smart man. He had enough sense to bring it to me to help him put it together.
To a professional.
So I encourage people to do their own work, but don't ever forget, motorcycles are dangerous, and you know, you can make simple amateur mistakes that are going to put your life in danger. So please pay attention, and if it's at all unfamiliar, have a professional do it for you. Because your life can depend on it. And I mean, I'm all.
I think we grow up in a generation now where everybody's on YouTube and thinks that, like, you know, I'll just watch a couple of videos on YouTube and that'll be it. So you got to be careful with this stuff, and hence why I wanted to bring my engine to a professional, because, you know, it's not only that there's expensive components inside the engine. My life is on the line, you know, like I'm sitting on top of this thing, you know. That's right. So, you know, you want to get it done properly, and just be safe, guys. Like, you know, be smart about it.
That's right. And so, if anybody wants me to do this kind of work for them, that's what I specialize in, is 1960s to 1990 Japanese, European classic motorcycles. So,
and make sure you check out Jeff's website. Here's the link down here. Check out his stuff. He does vintage bikes, predominantly.
Classic and vintage motorcycles. Oh, exclusively. I really don't work on anything newer than 90.
And he knows his stuff.
Because there's not very many people who understand the old bikes and will actually work on them.
Right.
That's the biggest problem with owning a classic bike, is finding somebody who knows what they're doing with them. So I'm your guy.
Well, there you go. So check Jeff out. Thanks for watching everything, guys. The motor is finally finished. Take a look at it. It looks beautiful. Now I just have to finish the side covers and everything and get all the oil slinger and everything installed, and I can do that on my own. And then we'll put this bike in the engine, we'll put the engine in the bike, in the frame, and then I'll continue on with the project. So again, Jeff, I'll give you that left-hander.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you for everything, and it's been a pleasure. And thanks for watching, guys. And don't forget to subscribe. Hit the like button if you like the videos that we're putting out. It takes a lot of time to produce and edit all this stuff. So if you like what's going on, please subscribe, tell your friends, share the video, and thanks again, Jeff. Make sure you guys come back again, because I still got a lot to do with the bike. Thanks again, Jeff, and check out another episode of Saturday's Wrench. Till next time.
Bye.